Hello everyone, this is Gabriel Stein, Director Asset Management Services at Oxford Economics. I'm sitting here with Andy Goodwin, who is our lead UK economist, and for this week's podcast we are going to discuss the UK general election. Just a reminder to those of you who may be living on a different planet, the UK general election takes place on Thursday the 7th of May. And it will probably be some time before we know the results, because this is commonly believed to be one of the most difficult to call elections in a very long time, not least because it looks like it will not only not be a single party getting a majority, but it may well prove to be impossible to form a majority government with less than three parties. Andy, one of the things that has been much discussed is that all this uncertainty is having a negative impact on the British economy. But you have already written about this. What's your view?
We actually take the opposite view. Certainly, I think if you look at the evidence, then, for instance, in terms of the corporate side, looking at investment intentions, there's really very little evidence that firms have been pushed off course by this. You think about policy uncertainty in a sort of more general form. Most measures of policy uncertainty, in particular the version that we track, which comes from the University of Stanford, suggests that policy uncertainty is quite low at the moment. And if you move into the financial market sphere, you look at what's happened to sterling, you look at what's happened to equities over the course of the last few months. They've actually performed better in the last few months than they did in the previous general election campaigns of 2010, 2005 or 2001. And that comes despite the fact that the opinion polls have been very close for quite some time, and indeed really have barely moved from suggesting this very indecisive outcome for 4 or 5 months now.
Is this perhaps because markets are looking forward to governments that won't be able to command a majority in Parliament and therefore won't be able to do very much and will therefore leave business alone to get on with things?
Now, I suspect that there may be a part of that. I think what we're seeing now from the various parties is probably the biggest divergence in terms of policies for at least the last 20-25 years. However, if there is obviously a minority government in particular, some of the more extreme edges to these policies will obviously be knocked off. The policies won't be able to get a majority in Parliament. So therefore, I think what markets are expecting is for a sort of watered down version of this, and therefore, for instance, if you're looking at the policies the Conservatives follow, it's unlikely they'll get an EU referendum or the very severe austerity they're looking for. And if you look towards the other side, some of the more left-wing policies that Labour are potentially going to pursue, they could also be knocked off course by the lack of a majority.
This is actually quite interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's very clear that politics tends to move in waves. Occasionally the voters will vote for the middle-of-the-road parties that command the centre ground. Occasionally they want clear blue water between the parties. And what you're saying is it seems as if we're now in a period of clear blue water. And yet, looking at the economic programs of the parties as expressed in the manifestos, you've made the point that there isn't terribly much difference between them. For all that you just said, there are large differences between the parties, but is that still the case economically, or are they very similar?
Well, I think the biggest difference it comes in terms of the fiscal rules that each of the parties want to pursue. So if you look at the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties, their ideas are fairly similar. They want to balance the current budget, so that's basically getting day-to-day spending covered by tax revenues over the course of the next Parliament. The Conservatives want to go quite a lot further than that, so they also want to cover investment spending by increased tax revenues.
Now let me just ask on that point. Isn't it very easy to muddle the borderline between those two issues, day-to-day spending and investment spending?
Certainly it is. Certainly I think if you look at sort of various areas of spending, for instance, things like repairing roads, you can make a very good case for them being in either capital or the current side of the budget. But I think in this case, and I think when we're looking at the difference between the two sets of parties, you're looking at such a large discrepancy that there is a genuine sort of cause for difference here. And I think if we're sort of thinking about it in terms of numbers, you're looking at a difference in excess of £30 billion, or about 1.4% of GDP, in the final year of this Parliament. So I think that would have a material difference on the impact.
But that's on the deficit side. And on the growth side?
On the growth side, we've plugged all of these scenarios into our global economic model and seen how it would actually affect the outlook. And what we found is that the less austere policies pursued by Labour and Liberal Democrats would result in the level of GDP being about 1 percentage point higher in the final year of the Parliament than would be achieved under the Conservative plans. Put simply, they are taking less demand out of the economy, and therefore economic growth is that much higher.
But still, I mean, we're talking 1% over the course of 5 years, or we're talking 1.5% on the deficit. Does that really justify saying that the differences between the parties are at a 25-year high?
Well, if you compare to, for instance, where we were in 2010, I think in 2010 almost all of the parties were singing from the same song sheet. They all wanted to reduce the deficit as quickly as possible. It was very much a sort of an austerity rhetoric that was being pushed. And I think that's generally been the case for most of the budgets we've seen, or most of the elections we've seen over the course of the last 20 years. It's very rare for the parties to be quite so far apart as they are now.
Okay, I'll take that on board. But then looking at the parties, the core of any coalition will either be the core of any government will either be the Conservatives or the Labour Party. So the Liberal Democrats, whatever happens, they will have a marginal influence, depending on who they join and how well they do. But you previously alluded to some of the other parties. Now, we know that the Liberal Democrats could go either way, either with the Tories or with Labour. But for the Tories, you have UKIP as a potential supporter. I don't know what UKIP's economic views are, but if you can tell us a little bit about those. And then for Labour, of course, we have the Scottish nationalists, who are very much more left-wing, and we have the Greens and maybe even the Welsh nationalists. And so my point is really going back to what you said earlier also, that whatever the parties say right now, that's not going to happen, because they will be beholden to other parties who will presumably extract a pound of flesh for their support.
I think that's a fair point, but I think the point I would make as well is that if you're looking at the various groups that you may have supporting either side in the next government, then it's much easier to see overlaps between the left-wing parties, so Labour, Liberal Democrats, and mainly the SNP, than it is sort of to see the Conservatives finding much help. Now that's partly a sort of that function of the policies they're tending to pursue, but also it's a function of the electoral arithmetic as well. So, for instance, you're looking at the Scottish National Party commanding probably somewhere in the region of 55 or 56 of the 59 seats in Scotland, so producing quite a significant number of MPs, but only on about a 4% share of the UK-wide vote. UKIP, on the other hand, you're looking at potentially getting 12% or so of the UK vote, and maybe only having 1 or 2 MPs. Now that obviously pushes the electoral arithmetic much more towards the left-wing parties. So what you're going to looking at really there is probably a Labour minority government being able to pass legislation with support from the SNP because of really having its like-minded ideals. Whereas if you look at the right-wing sort of arithmetic, you're relying pretty much on the Conservatives to have almost all of the MPs in any sort of electoral arrangement with UKIP, simply because UKIP are potentially going to commit so few MPs to the party.
And a continuation of the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition in some form?
The biggest challenge in terms of continuing the current sort of status quo, I think, is the collapse of the Liberal Democrat vote since 2010. In 2010, the Liberal Democrats had 57 MPs, since which they've lost one for a by-election. But most of the forecasting models that we follow suggest that they'll have somewhere between 25 and 30 this time around. Now, if you add that to the likely numbers the Conservatives are going to have, which is probably somewhere in the region of 280 to 285, that leaves the pair of them quite a long way short of what they would need to command a majority in the House of Commons. If you then add in the fact that there seems to be some tension, I think it's fair to say, between the parties, the experience of 5 years of government together has not always been as fruitful and as enjoyable as it may be. And I think there are quite a few what they call red lines between the parties, which may prevent them working together quite as closely this time around. And certainly, I think if you're thinking about the arithmetic and passing legislation, it may be harder to enforce the discipline that requires all of the MPs on both sides of those parties to all vote for a common cause. So I think it's going to be a challenge, I think, for the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats to govern again. I think what you would need to see is quite a substantial swing towards the Conservatives in the last week for that to actually happen.
Is that possible? And the reason I'm asking is, if we go back to the first time I experienced the UK election, that was in 1992, and everyone knew that Labour was going to win, and of course at the end of the day the Conservatives got a majority of 11 seats. Could it possibly be that all the polls are so wrong that in fact we will end up with something going either way, by the way, not just the Tory way or possibly even the Labour way, that's going to be more stable than we currently think?
Certainly there is a possibility, particularly I think for the Conservatives, being the incumbents. There tends to be a greater amount of the undecideds declaring for the incumbent in the end, and also I think there is a sort of a long-running tendency for Conservative voters to be a little bit shy in coming forward when pollsters ask them about their own voting intentions. But I think even so, I think the Conservatives would I think need to at least win as many seats as they won last time in order to sort of offset the sort of losses that Liberal Democrats will suffer, and that looks very unlikely, I think, as far as the polls are now. Certainly, there's been very little movement in the polls for quite some time now, 3 or 4 months.
I see. One last question: are you going to vote?
I will indeed, but obviously it would be remiss of me to admit who exactly I'm going to vote for.
I didn't ask that. Just wanted to know if you were going to vote. Andy Goodwin, lead UK Economist, thank you very much. And in a week's time, or perhaps 10 days' time, we will presumably begin to see what the result of this contested election will be. Thank you very much, everyone. We will be back with a new podcast next week.